So we'll get this this show on the road. So we've had wonderful presentation this morning, touching on the topic of different types of models. A few of them on foundation models. We'll have some more later on this afternoon. And so, since this is quite a hot topic, and I feel kind of weird being behind the panels, but there's not a lot of, but the point here would be to guide a discussion about these new tools and their roles in neuroscience, and especially neuro-AI at the intersection of what we can understand about intelligence. And so to kick off the panel, I think it's nice to think a little bit about the first talk of the day. So Patrick laid out a good lay of the land of how these models are being developed, how the different types of these models are out there. But really, I'd like to propose a few topics to get the panel going here, but then we'll turn it over to the room and guide the discussion this way. So a few of the speakers have presented already. I think the only person on the panel that hasn't yet is Smita Krishnaswamy, who's from Yale, who's working on a lot of these types of models, but from sort of a geometric learning perspective, as we've nicely heard throughout her question. The other members of the panels I don't think need much introduction, so let's jump into it right now. So here's a controversial question that I would like to begin with, which is, can foundation models actually help science? That is, the mechanistic understanding that we could get from the brain, as opposed to being really sophisticated, just predictive tools, right? In other words, these models can be argued are kind of black boxes that do amazing inference, that can generalize, so on and so forth. But if you crack them open, is there a mechanistic lesson to be learned from these systems, given the fact that the architectures that are used might be very different, such as transformers, et cetera, et cetera. So who wants to jump on this first? Smita?
I mean, I would say that I only jumped on the foundation model bandwagon when I thought it could help discover science. So I think a key use of these is to train on a lot of data, and I can give you kind of a specific example. We're trying to understand splicing in neurons. So train on a lot of neurons with a lot of splicing data, but what we want to actually understand is, when does a neuron decide to splice or edit an RNA? So I think the attribution mechanism, the attention, or whatever attribution mechanisms you have, get trained equally well as the prediction. So the prediction's almost like a proxy loss. We can see if the RNA is spliced. So I think if you build in attribution mechanisms, that could be sort of its primary use, is to crack these open.
Anybody wants to follow up?
I think Paul's going to dissent, so I'm going to agree before I hand the microphone to Paul. Yeah, because I think that when you imagine how complex and nonlinear so many of these neural interactions would be, I mean, something that is extremely adept at finding very complex statistical patterns in data and then showing them to you is nothing but an advantage for things like scientific discovery. I mean, whenever you start putting neurons through embedding spaces and then just looking at scale, what sort of patterns or structure do you emerge, commonalities or divergences, of course that takes the legwork to believe what these types of spaces might tell you when you reverse engineer them. So it's not that you can just take the off-the-shelf transformer and train it on all of Dandy and then say we've now solved science. But I think if you're principled and clear in how you're approaching it, doing the right checks and balances at every stage, I think we can get to a point where it becomes a very useful tool for scientific research.
Mm-hmm.
So I was asked to be on this panel because otherwise it seemed like everyone was of the same opinion, and so I'm supposed to be the dissenting voice, and I missed Patrick's talk, but I'm told that he put me on an extreme point of a triangle of some sort. I'm not really that extreme. I mean, I think like everyone, it's any really powerful tool is great, and you know, then there's the question of I don't think anybody. You know, questions the power of the prediction, especially if we're going to apply it to something like, you know, diagnosis or prognosis. So I think that's great, and it's very good for doing data analysis. The only question is, you know, to what extent, like Guillaume asked, to what extent does it help our science? And I think it can, but I think there's a few things that we just want to be a little bit cautious about. So maybe more the cautious optimism or cautious pessimism. Or anyway, the point is that it depends on the data we put in. And I think a trust in data on its own is dangerous because, and I'll give an example. And the question really comes down to how do we weigh the data? So the example is large language models trained on the internet. They get kind of racist and sexist. And part of the reason for that is that there's a lot of that out on the internet. And we've recognized that, and people have tried to prevent that from sort of coloring their product. But it's hard. It's hard to do that. It's actually proven to be rather difficult to make them not racist without making them just kind of like completely in the opposite direction. So I think that problem faces neuroscience as well, because we have certain kinds of data available to us in large volumes, and other types of data we don't have in large volumes. So for example, MRI data, we have enormous databases of MRI data, but that has certain limitations, like low temporal resolution. We have much less intracellular recordings in brainstem circuits. And we have a lot less data from awake behaving animals doing naturally sort of ecologically relevant tasks. So the problem is that we have biased data sets, and they're extremely biased for specific types of things like cognitive stuff. It's going to be mostly MRI. Now the problem is that we don't know what the repercussions of it will be. We're not going to be able to recognize that the things it produces are incorrect. And racism is easy to see, but a bad hypothesis or bad scientific conclusions, how will we know them if they're there? So my point is that by relying on data this much, we risk letting the data guide us in a direction which actually is sort of entrenching particular worldviews and particular methods, frankly, of data collection. And I think it might be hard to snap out of that and to know how to deal with that. But I think we can do it. I just think we have to be sort of more cautious, maybe, than optimistic, at least in the beginning. Or we're just going to entrench certain assumptions about what data is actually even relevant. Anyway.
I fully agree with what Paul just said. To be clear, I think that if you don't head into the question of your data collection and the way in which you approach your balancing in your data sets and stuff like that, the data might end up indeed guiding you towards unhelpful places. But let's just, for the sake of optimism's sake for a moment, assume that we'll be able to deal with that tangled problem and have some awareness of it. The reason that I think if we do that, it would then give us a great deal of scientific insight to build these foundation models, relates to a phenomenon that I think people have been observing more and more in foundation models across a variety of domains. And it relates to this concept that some researchers recently called in a paper the Platonic representation hypothesis. So interestingly, when people have been comparing the representations across a number of different neural networks, as foundation models get larger and more powerful, they tend to converge on a similar set of representations, even if they're from different modalities. So for example, if you compare a language model and a vision model of sufficient power, and you give them inputs related to trees, the ways in which they'll represent trees are actually similar to each other. Now, why is that happening? Well, our best guess right now is that it's because these networks are ultimately having to discover the underlying latent variables that generated the data in the world in order to do their pre-training. And so you can think of this almost like the equivalent of, any type of latent variable discovery, whether it be VAEs or ICA or whatever. There's an implicit optimization towards discovering of underlying latent variables with a powerful enough neural network trained to either predict or fill in data in a self-supervised manner. And so then the hope would be with the foundation models is that something similar would happen. So across multiple modalities of data, even if we're looking at very different types of data from very different species, what would ultimately be learned by these networks are the underlying latent variables in the brain that generated that data. And that's why they would be useful for scientific discovery, because now we'd have this artifact, this network, that actually contained within its weights some representation of the underlying latent variables that guide things in the brain. And the hope would be that those would be the kinds of latent variables of the sort that drive kind of similar dynamics across species and core computations across cortex, et cetera. So that's my sort of optimistic note. But Paul's 100% right. That all depends on getting it right with respect to the data and being conscious of the problems that arise from a purely data-driven perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would ask the panel, so I know there's at least an example of people from Anthropic doing these sparse autoencoders to try to reverse engineer the networks. And I think there you end up with something like kind of what you're talking about, Blake, of correlations between representations, but not much more than that. And there's nothing really to say about dynamical systems as far as I understand it. So yeah, maybe people can explain more to me about, because maybe I'm just unfamiliar with approaches to do reverse engineering that could really develop our intuitions and understanding of biological systems.
I think that some of the work on mechanistic interpretability that came out from Anthropic, Chris Sola's work and his team in the past has been very highly popularized, and it's one kind of mechanistic interpretability. So first of all, I'm very excited about approaches that leverage models which have dynamics, so that you could potentially apply dynamical systems analysis, as we heard earlier, either DSA from Mila Feet's group or the kinds of work that you're doing for models that are state-space models, Mamba, and those variants. So that's on one end. And on the other end, I'm also very excited about models, about another kind of mechanistic interpretability, which is really about causal mediation analysis, where people transplant different activations, different representations from one model to the other, and it is truly astounding what we can do there. We can do things like zap out an entire layer, zap out an entire head, replace the activations from one sentence to another sentence, and do all the kinds of causal mediation analyses that, if we could do this in neuroscience, we would do them. If we had access to all these optogenic tools, like holographic optogenetics, so that we could actually implant a particular pattern inside of the dynamical system, which is inside the brain, to figure out what's going on, or uncovering some line attractor, for instance. And I think there was recent work along that direction from, I believe, Scott Linderman's group, right? We would adapt those tools. So there is absolutely a dialogue, but I think that because transformers don't have dynamics, a lot of our most powerful tools to study them in neuroscience just don't apply. And although a lot of the early mechanistic interpretability work was very much inspired by some of the approaches in neuroscience, now we're seeing a divergence from the fact that, well, one's transformers and the other one is mostly dynamical systems.
Yep.
I guess I would just say that I think so. I kind of agree with you that I mean, it's difficult to interpret these large transformer models. So while I'm on the foundation model bandwagon, I don't think that the architecture doesn't matter. I think the architecture hugely matters for the interpretability. So some of what we're trying to shift to are other modalities of foundation models. For example, graph dynamics-based foundation models, and generally graph foundation models where the entities are identifiable and then the interactions are encoded as with some kind of edge attention and things like that. So I think we'll see kind of I don't know if I want to call it a reversion, but return to thinking about what is the right kind of architecture that we build in from the beginning so that we can read out what's happening at the end.
Yeah. So this has been great. We've touched on a bunch of these topics that I actually had prepared. I'd like to maybe touch on one little topic before opening up to the room here, which is the idea of hypothesis testing, right? So we've touched on it on this discussion. And really there's a question about using these big AI tools right now that might revive Descartes' ghost, right, about hypothesis testing, right? Like a lot of ways we do science now are not necessarily just stringent like hypothesis like testing, right? There's a lot of exploratory sort of and valuable exploratory endeavors that come out of building these models. So what are the pros and cons of using these big tools and dedicating so much resources to these things that are not necessarily hypothesis driven? I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'd love to hear the panel on this.
Hypothesis generation, right?
A generation, so it's meta-hypothesis.
Right,
like
I mean, in
sense,
the past, scientists would have, limited hypotheses coming from the experiments they could do in their lab, but now I think that one of the main uses of AI tools in science is to generate unexpected hypotheses, potentially.
Yep.
So I mean, I think that is a concern, is whether our hypothesis will become sort of entrenched by our data rather than we use our hypotheses to tell us what data to seek. So I mean, theories about the brain go through a lot of different upheavals and mainstreams and revolutions. And if you look at the history of psychology, their thinking has gone up and down one way and another way quite a lot. And there's no reason to believe that all the things that we believe now are necessarily going to be true, and that 100 years from now, people won't look back and say, oh, God, they were so wrong about that, right? But the thing is, and this is, I think, where, again, I would raise a concern. If we use our data-driven approaches to inspire our hypotheses, then whatever assumptions went into the data we collected are going to become entrenched, and it's going to be very difficult to snap out of them. Like, for example, there is, again, like I said, most data is collected under a particular assumption of a kind of a message-passing encoding model of the brain, where the subject is essentially doing nothing, something turns on, and then they do something, and then you repeat. Now, there's many reasons to believe that does not capture behavior very well, but the vast majority of data is from that paradigm, and it's relatively non-dynamic, again. And I think it's going to be very hard if we build a foundation model that's sort of entrenches that assumption just because the data is that way. And I'll make an analogy here to the Allen Atlas of the mouse, which is beautiful. I love it. I wish we had something like that for a monkey. But one of the dangers of the Allen Atlas is because it's so available to us that whatever assumptions it embodies become like the language that where you draw the border between M1 and M2 is controversial, actually. And yet, because we have this tool that lets us do everything so nicely about like connectivity, but if we buy into that particular assumption. So I think that the danger is that we have assumptions, even if you're doing purely data-driven, there are assumptions about how you chose to collect the data. And those assumptions become more and more entrenched if we then sort of have this kind of self-reinforcing loop of hypotheses themselves coming from the data. Again, the Einstein's model of the universe would have been difficult to get from observational data about the movement of planets, because almost all of it would have been completely predicted by the current thinking. Right? So it'd be very hard to snap out of it.
So maybe
So
one
I'm
or two interventions, and then we'll
Sorry, I was just going to respond to Paul a little bit.
Yeah.
I think if we're going to snap out of any hallucinations in any field, it's going to be science, right? Because if it generates a hypothesis, all you have to do is test it. If it's false, you're out, right? So I think that science is the key field where we can avoid hallucinations in neural networks.
And I'm very highly cognizant of that point, and I think it's a great point. But we've had a discussion offline, which, if you don't mind, we can raise, which is that Paul has been working on decision making, among other things, for a long time. In the decision making, we often make these very reductive assumptions, where an animal is forced to saccade to a certain location and make certain decisions. And part of that is really technology driven. Being able to do head-free recordings is difficult, and part of it is data analysis driven. If we don't have the right models in order to be able to analyze the data, then even collecting the data is not really worth it, because what are you going to do with the data? So I think that to your point, part of the reason that we don't have a lot of this head-free naturalistic data is that for a long time we just didn't know how to analyze it, and maybe using more powerful methods to embed data into representations will allow us to understand exactly the kind of more naturalistic data that you were talking about. And to Laura's point, I really loved I think it was the first or second slide that you said, these things can then be used as a kind of new model organism that we can study in turn.
Yeah. Okay, so Pierre has been patiently waiting. So let's turn over to Pierre from the audience to ask questions here.
All right, so I wanted to follow on something that Matt presented in terms of aligning across subjects, and you hinted about the fact that if the behavior itself was highly variable, then this would translate into large differences in representations. And that was on fairly simple grasping tasks, right? So I'm just wondering if it makes sense to you to try to build foundation of neural data if we don't have a matching foundation model for behavior, because behavior is extremely variable over time, across individual, across species, and definitely tied deeply to neuronal representations.
Fully agree. I think that brains without behavior are just noise. I mean, it has no meaning unless it's doing something. At least, if we say we want to understand the brain, what's the purpose unless you're trying to understand something about how that brain gave rise to behavior? So it's certainly, I would place the bet that we need to be considering behavior if we're going to have the types of things that will scale in the way that we're speculating. And that's one of the reasons why I think certainly me and probably many here are interested in more multimodal approaches for training these types of models, so we can look for joint representations across these neurobehavior relationships and stuff.
If I may add to that. I think, though, to directly address what you're getting at, the key point is that Matt was implementing a series of analyses that are looking at whether the data is aligned within a relatively simple set of transformations that are possible. And so the reason, in fact, that we need to go the route of a foundation model is precisely because when you start expanding beyond very similar behaviors, to now see the shared dynamics will require a much more complicated set of transformations. Far more complicated than you could learn with just, the kind of dynamical similarity analysis that he was doing, I would guess.
Yeah, I think this is such a fundamental point, obviously. I'm very interested in behavior. But so for example, in the tasks where the different model organisms were doing reaching tasks, it was humans doing handwriting where they're imagine reaching their arm in dramatic ways to outline the cursive letters that are being decoded, or animals, the monkeys were reaching in different directions on a screen, or the mice reaching in space to do the lever. So each one of these are the alignment, I think, is going to be really dependent on the fact that it was all these forearm reaching type behaviors, at least is my understanding. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see the extent to which there's overlap, the way Blake described in like the text versus visual spaces being like aligned versus there just being like separate systems that are implementing each one of these behaviors. And I think that will depend on the extent of like the data that we have and the amount that data from one kind of behavior can speak to data from another kind of behavior. So I think we really need to be thinking very deeply about the relationship between the different tasks that we are having the animals do as we're doing the neural recordings.
I want to add one point, because you mentioned like the handwriting and stuff. So there's this great work from Stanford, like Krishna's lab, on speech decoding. It actually works best from this motor cortical area and not from any of the language areas that they tried implanting, because they're actually picking up on imagined movements about the tongue and the mouth and things. So the idea of like a language, like you have to have a different language system and a different reaching system or something, I don't think would necessarily be true, because so many things will be connected at different scales.
So I should say that the reason why it worked better for arm reaching movements is because those arrays were implanted in arm area of motor cortex.
They also work for speech, though.
Well,
it was in the hand knob.
Right, so Sergey's work was all about doing speech decoding with like imagined speaking, and so that works because you have these distributed maps where motor cortex that's dedicated to arm movements also have information about leg movements and mouth movements and everything else until the arm moves, at which point everything else gets squashed.
Yeah.
So it is compositional and not compositional in this way. So you can decode things that chunk of brain weren't sort of like intended to be driving, but the best thing that you can decode from that particular chunk of cortex is arm movements, which is why Frank's work of like these imagined, like huge, like imagine drawing the letter A like this was like much easier to decode than like a person imagining speaking the letter A while decoding in arm cortex.
Yeah, I mean, fully agree. I would put less intention on what it was meant to do. I don't think it's coincidence that you have useful information in these other contexts in these areas.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, all body parts are
Yeah.
probably having to be coordinated in some way.
exactly.
So I suggest we take the next question from the audience.
Well, I guess it's a follow-up in the sense that if we, a big push in neuroscience is more naturalistic, more open-ended, more ecological, more real world type of scenarios, and that's what we want to move away from how we've done trial by trial lab tasks that are very reduce everything to some minimal atomic little operation that an animal or a human does. So if we take that approach in neuroscience, can we actually see a path to doing these kinds of taking the foundation models types of approaches that everyone discussed in this morning to something that is that open-ended in the sense that, I mean, will you need to collect years worth of data from millions of participants as opposed to a few thousand that Meta was working on the wrist thing for scrolling and turn the page or something like that? And so I wonder how these two things can be reconciled in a sense.
Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so I'm very much excited about this as well, going to naturalistic behavior, and many people have, and we want to do it ourselves as well. I mean, we just wrote a couple grants on this, so if we get one, we're going to go for it. But as everyone has learned, interpreting the data is difficult. And I think part of the reason is that once we get away from the controlled environment, we don't have control over the data. And the problem is having more data here doesn't necessarily help, because the animals don't design good experiments. They don't dissociate variables well. They just do stuff, and you get a lot of correlations. And even very sophisticated ways can't ever get around that. But I do think that what we can do is more of a stepwise approach. So Andrea Green and I wrote a paper about this, suggesting that really what we want is we want to have something that gradually moves from where we actually have hypotheses and gradually releases some of those constraints. But not go jumping all the way to the no man's world where we have no hypothesis for natural behavior. So we loosen the constraints and we move to something that's a little bit more unconstrained. And then once we're ready, we move to the next one. And I think that doesn't have to be very long and time consuming. We can get to some pretty sophisticated behavior pretty quickly. And that's already been done in a number of situations, like head-free gaze control in superior colliculus has been understood in this kind of stepwise way. So I think we can do this, and along the way we can use whatever tools are available to us to analyze the data, because it's going to be overwhelming, and look for things like, you know, structure in the manifold, for example. You know, what is the effect of context on a behavior that looks the same at a muscular level? I think we can do that.
Right, but the naturalistic part is being done, but I mean in combination with these techniques that require so much data to learn very complex, high-dimensional, nonlinear spaces and dynamics.
I think that's still. I think that's still an empirical question. You know, I'll contrast like two views of the dimensionality of neural activity, for instance, which is the view that came to fore from Carson Stringer's work and from several others that showed that there's high-dimensional neural activity in the visual cortex. Versus some of the work that we see in manifolds in motor cortex, where often, you know, the dimensionality is 2 or 3 dimensional. And so obviously if you're trying to find what the manifold is, and you have tons and tons of dimensions, it's going to take, you know, tons and tons of data. And so the question is, what's the actual real dimensionality of neural activity? I think it's Gao and Ganguly they have this beautiful theory for why, you know, the manifold is a certain dimension, and it depends on the dimensionality of the task. So if you have the monkey move his arm around in a two-dimensional plane, then that restricts the dimensionality of the neural activity, and vice versa. And so what we'll very likely to find is that in these high-dimensional tasks, these high-entropy tasks in which a monkey can define themselves what they're going to do, they're going to explore a larger proportion of the space, which would take a long time to learn. But there will be lots of dimensions that have a little bit of variance, and those are going to be really hard, I think, to narrow down. And that will very likely require either lots of data, or once we find those dimensions and we see that they're of interest, we'll have to collect data specifically for that kind of paradigm. And so I vibe with your with your idea of going in a stepwise kind of fashion, except that I would just go the other way around. Like, you do the hog wild thing, and then you roll back a little bit to narrow in on certain hypotheses which are generated in this more free form.
So I want to add to that, because I also am a proponent of the go hog wild and then step back approach. And I think I want to get at something that I think you were driving at with your question, which is that actually, if you move towards naturalistic behaviors and recording conditions, that is precisely the scenario you want for training foundation models. So that's for 2 reasons. The first is the one that Perich already identified, which is that you're not going to be able to analyze that kind of data using standard analysis techniques. So you need foundation models to even start to think about how to analyze that kind of data, unless you've done a really careful stepwise approach like Paul is describing. But chances are, if you just go hog wild from the get-go, if you start collecting naturalistic behavior now, you got nothing to analyze that data with, man. You're going to need a foundation model to do it. The second thing is, though, how are you ever going to get to the point where you can actually scale up data collection to the level that we're really talking about here, right? Like, how realistic is it to get a set of well-controlled trial-by-trial experiments on the orders of millions of hours of recording? I'd say almost zilch. But you could imagine a scenario where you have a sort of like factory neuroscience style thing where there are just animals living with electrodes in their brains, and you are constantly collecting data 24/7 for months on end. Now you're getting to the point where you might actually get foundation level scale of data. So I actually think as we move towards naturalistic, unconstrained, open behaviors, this approach of foundation models makes more and more and more sense. And in fact, it's only in the highly constrained trial-by-trial, hypothesis-driven scientific approach that foundation models don't make sense.
That's right. I should mention also that there's already proof of concept of these types of approaches. Scott Lindemans has work on lifelong recording in
Right.
these zebrafish, and you have incredibly rich sort of dichotomy of neural states and so on and so forth. So there's value there. So time is advancing. We'll have time for one short question from Karim here, because we'll have to go to lunch. Or do you want to switch? Okay. One last question to the panel, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
You kind of already answered my question here, but it was just, I've seen in other fields in biology where you have the idea of a virtual cell where they're able to test different drugs to see the interactions with the cell. And now there's a bunch of different startups that are trying to add AI into that mix. But would it make sense to even have like a virtual brain, or is it even possible to have this type of virtual brain in order to test new theories and like collect more data in this case?
I mean, this was the idea of the Blue Brain Project, which had successes and not successes, depending on your perspective. I think it's just hard, because it depends on your purpose. If you want to study whether your drug is going to cure Alzheimer's, I mean, having the molecular resolution to know exactly how that drug is going to affect this network, probably not in the short term, I would at least say. If you want to explore more abstract theories that you think could be captured in statistical modeling of some modality of neural recordings, yes, but then I think to the other question, like we would probably want to embody that somehow. I mean, if you're doing like whole body simulation of agents and environments with these foundation models that are driving activity, and then you might get somewhere for like virtual neuroscience.
Perfect.
That was it. Thank
Any
you.
other interventions? Okay, so please join me in thanking the panel once more.